All right. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Mark Westfall. Dr. Westfall has 30 years of child, adolescent, and adult experience in public, private, inpatient, and outpatient settings. He is currently serving as president and owner of Westfall Psychiatric Service in Birmingham. Please type any questions that you have during the presentation into the Q&A box for Dr. Westfall to answer at the end of the presentation. Dr. Westfall, the mic is now yours.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us. We've got a lot of different types of providers listening. So this talk is going to be fairly broad in scope, but it's going to be narrowed to the overall concept of addiction and brain function. And I hope you walk away with a new understanding, if you don't already have this understanding already, that will help all of you in whatever area of providing healthcare that you currently exist. I think you'll all find it helpful to take this new concept with you as you move forward in helping others. All right, so let me see if I can change this slide. Do I have that access? I'm on the screen. Give me 1 second to make sure. Sometimes the commands don't show up. And Celia, there we go. Okay, we're going to start with a polling question. Poll question number 1. Oh, by the way, as we go through this, the Q&A box is for me. If you have a question for me, please ask. I'm going to be interacting with you. I'm normally a very interactive person when I do these talks in an in-person setting. So I want your feedback. And then if you thumb up that question, it'll move it up in the list so I know that more people have questions, agree with that question, so I'll go to that one first. All right, first poll question for you, because I want you to be engaged in this, 3 parts. Have you had an experience with a patient with an addiction? Do you know a coworker with an addiction? Do you know a friend or family member with an addiction? I'm going to give you just a few seconds to fill it out, so quickly answer those, and then we're going to get some numbers behind that to see what the audience experience is all about. All right, so first one, have you had experience with a patient? 94%. I'm talking to the right group then. Do you know a coworker with addiction? 40%. Do you have a friend or family member? 83%. What do we know from these numbers? This audience, and you're not alone, by the way, every audience that I ask these questions answers similarly. Addiction is very common. It's touched all of our lives at some point. And I really hope today's conversation will help you conceive of it a little differently than maybe you have so far. All right, so no matter what area that you're working in, whether you're a physician, nurse, pharmacist, dentist, social worker, psychologist, whatever area you're in, when we begin to engage with the treatment of someone with an addiction, it is like stepping into a briar patch, potentially, because first of all, we don't always know who has a problem with addiction, and we'll get into defining what that means in a minute. So we don't always know that there are thorns for this person's care until we're into the relationship with them, and then we find that there's some thorns, not that they're harming us necessarily, just that the normal process of treatment may have some catches in it, that we need to behave differently for this person. For example, if you're a prescriber, it is critically important that you know and understand the concept behind addiction before you prescribe them a medication that could be potentially addictive. It's certainly something that you would walk through that briar patch a little differently than some other briar patch. So you have to really understand the science behind addiction if you're going to engage in treating someone with addiction. And this is true whether you're treating them or not. This is true if you have a family member or you yourself need to understand that the experience of addiction alters how that person or you engages with their environment. So we're going to move on, and I'll explain what I mean by this thorny beginning. All right, polling question number 2. A person who struggles with addiction misuse of substance, a person who struggles with addiction misuses substances because the pleasure they experience outweighs the consequences of using them. So a person who struggles with addiction misuses substances, there should be an S after misuse, misuses substances because the pleasure they experience outweighs the consequences of using them. True or false? Just give you a few seconds and then we'll see what your thoughts on that are. All right, see what our poll says. So 60-40 think it's true that a person who struggles with addiction misuses substances because they experience the pleasure that outweighs consequences of using them. I'm going to come back to this question after the next portion of my talk, and we'll see how your response to it is in. So let's remember 60-40. All right. Now, next, we have one more polling question before I go into some details. All people have a neurocircuitry that predisposes them to addiction. All people have a neurocircuitry that predisposes them to addiction. True or false? Give you just a second more. All right, let's see what we got. Okay. 60-40 in reverse. Curious, I wonder if it's the same 60-40 or not. All right, we'll also answer, I'm going to re-ask this question in just a little bit. Let's see what if our numbers differ. Now, let's move into what we're talking about first. I like to start with definitions so we all are talking about the same thing. Because even though we use the same words, frequently people have a misunderstanding or a misalignment with what someone else means when they use that word. So I like to discuss what I mean when I'm using these words for today's discussion. You don't have to agree with me on the definition, but this is the definition that I'm going to use for today. So it's important that you understand what I mean when I say these things. So let's go through them one at a time. Addiction, an addict or addiction. What I mean by that is when someone has difficulty regulating the wanting and utilization of something to the detriment of themselves. So someone has difficulty regulating the wanting and utilization of something to the detriment of themselves. I'm going to call that addiction, and someone who has that addiction is called an addict. All right? Normally when I do these presentations, I'm in a room with people and I can see in their eyes if they're following or not. So I'm just going to have to presume you're following. And if you have questions as we go along, again, use the Q&A box. The chat box is for the people behind the scenes. If you have a technology issue, yada, yada, or if you want to talk to each other, chat screen. Q&A for me. All right. Physical dependence and psychological dependence. Physical dependence is taking a substance regularly enough to produce a biological, physical effect upon cessation of use. Taking a substance, and I'm going to argue that it could be even a non-substance. If you're engaging in a behavior so much that when you stop it, you have a physiological experience when you no longer have it, that's called physical dependence. Psychological dependence, I'm going to argue for today's talk that is a false dichotomy. That's a false dichotomy of the brain-body continuum, or dualism, really, brain-body dualism. It's all the same. If you are psychologically dependent, there's a physiological reason behind that. So I'd prefer not to break them apart. And what I do is for those two things, physical and psychological dependence, I would put them under one word and call it a physiological dependence. physiological, biological. All right. So moving on now, craving. A craving is just a powerful desire for something, an urging, not like I want, you know, I don't know, a gift for my birthday. It's really a desire, a physical desire. Like I am thirsty. I really need some water right now. Want water right now. I'm compelled to the water. That's craving. All right, withdrawals. Those are physiological symptoms upon cessation of a substance. Back to the dependence definition we talked about. When you take it away, you have a physiological symptom. A tremor is an example. A mood drop is an example. So withdrawing from something is a physiological symptom we experience when we no longer have something that we have become physiologically dependent upon. Habituation. That is a neurological term, essentially. It's the diminishing of a physiological response of a stimulus. So if I normally take a medication and it makes me feel a certain way, and I take the medication over and over and over again, and now when I take one, I don't feel it anymore. Our brain, our neurology, our physiology has now habituated to that chemical, that medication I took. And that is clearly part of what creates withdrawals when we stop it, because we've become habituated to it. Our brain has become physiologically used to it. It doesn't have the same effect it used to have. That's called habituation. Dual diagnosis. Dual diagnosis is essentially having a diagnosis of a substance use disorder and a different mental disorder at the same time. Two mental conditions, one involving substance use, another involving any other mental health disorder. Addictive personality, that's a common one I hear. This to me is kind of like psychological dependence. It doesn't really hold water. It's misleading, and I don't use the term addictive personality. There's no such personality designation in my training or in the DSM, which is one of the books we use to help educate people about diagnosing. But forget all that. It is an oversimplification of the complexity of personality. And personality encompasses such a vast array of traits. There's no way to boil somebody down to one category of addictive personality. So I just prefer not to use that term. Last one, substance abuse or use. This is another term that I kind of flip on its head. Substance abuse. We all know what substance use is. Using a substance. You take something, you're using it. But substance abuse implies that we are abusing the substance. And it's a semantics, but I like to flip this around. I think you'll understand later why. I don't think that we abuse substances. I think we allow substances to abuse us. The reason I like to word that for people is it helps us gain a different perspective on who's actually being injured. The person that is having struggles with addiction is being injured by the substance. And if I can help that person see that substance as something that's causing them harm, the substance is abusing them, I'm more likely to be able to have them put their hand out and say, I don't want to be abused anymore. As opposed to if I say, you're abusing the substance, now I'm pointing fingers at the person and they're doing something wrong. So I find in the treatment of addiction, it's much more helpful to conceive of it as substances abuse us. We allow them to abuse us. We don't really abuse them. They're inanimate objects. So, all right, that's the definitions page. If you have any questions, I see one, let's see. So I've got a good question. With all respect, I see a difference between physiological and psychological dependence. No physical withdrawal, shakes, etc., from a gambler. Please clarify. Thanks. Great question. So here's where I would go with that. If you take gambling away from a gambler and they get depressed, that's a physiological reaction. If you have, if someone has become so dependent on something to lift their mood, and we'll get more of that later, and then you take it away and their mood drops, we know mood is a physiological event. It is a physical symptom. Depression is a physical condition. So when you introduce mood to the whole concept of physical, it now allows us to include physiological dependence in our definition. So let's see. Another question. Have you ever encountered someone that is less likely to take accountability for their actions if you say they are being abused by substances versus they are abusing substances? Great question. And we're jumping to the end, which I don't mind a bit. I love great questions, so I'm going to answer that one now. Have you encountered someone that's less likely to take accountability for their actions if you say they're being abused by substances versus they are abusing substances? I would say the exact opposite. Would I allow that person, and you'll understand when I go through my next segment why I say this. Someone who's struggling with addiction has gotten engaged in a relationship with a substance that they are having trouble getting out of. And they're already feeling like they're already down on themselves about the struggle they're having. And I help them gain control of what they actually have control over. You can actually set a boundary with something that's abusing you. But if you try to tell an addict that they actually can control engaging with this substance and not having that, and that substance not taking them off course, you're suggesting that they control something that they don't have control over. So I'm giving them something that they have control over, which is the relationship with the substance, not how the substance affects them. In other words, well, we'll get into more. Great question. All right, let's move on to the next part of my talk, and I think these questions may answer some of themselves. All right, so we're going to talk about the neurocircuitry of addiction. We're going to have 3 circuits. The first one is going to be the one that I think is going to be the most mind-blowing, okay, for you to grasp. So we're going to spend the most time on it. Circuit number 1, it's called the motivation reward circuitry, also called the wanting and liking circuitry. So let's learn about this first circuit, this neurocircuitry of addiction. I'm going to start with a video from the 50s. So here we go. Pay attention.
Perhaps we get pleasure from drugs because they stimulate the same brain areas as sex and food. Working in Montreal in the 1950s, James Olds devised a crucial test. He worked out a new way to, in effect, ask animals how they felt.
This is a device which trains the animal to turn on the stimulus for himself. Here you notice the animal wandering toward the pedal. When he first touches it, he gets no stimulation. It's not connected yet. Then one time he touches the pedal, it does turn on the stimulation. You can see the lights go on.
Now, the interesting thing about the old stimulation, the rewarding stimulation, was the strength of it. It was somewhat different than rewarding stimulation for food and water in that there was no satiation. Animals would continue for hours and hours and didn't seem to satiate. They didn't feel full. They would just keep doing it for long, long periods of time. They would do it to exhaustion.
Now, I will electrify the grid. The animal must cross an area that gives a very painful shock to the feet in order to get to the pedal and stimulate the brain.
And a rat wanting brain stimulation would brave a shock stronger than even a starving rat would brave to get food.
This shows a rat is willing to pay a very high price in order to get to the pedal.
Human addicts will pay just as high a price for their rewards.
The fascinating thing was that we found in our laboratory that every single drug an increased sensitivity of the animal to brain stimulation was either an abuse substance or a substance that has potential for abuse.
So James Old's technique of the 50s gave scientists a way of testing for the addictive potential of drugs, and a way to find out where in the brain they acted.
Now, I think there's general agreement that this is the area where the action is in terms of the rewarding effects of drugs, whether they be heroin, whether they be amphetamine, whether they be cocaine or angel dust or whatever any drug that produces rewarding effects, it's believed this is where the action is.
Using similar methods, Chris Fibiger and his colleagues in Vancouver wanted to know which pleasure areas are active when we crave both drugs and food. They found that the area Heath stimulated in his patients, the nucleus accumbens, is the center of a key network, the dopamine circuit. Heroin seems to act in one way. Cocaine in another. And both hit the nucleus accumbens, which the Canadian scientists recently proved is also active when we crave food.
If we selectively take these dopamine neurons out of that part of the brain, the animal loses interest in self-administering cocaine, it seems. Apparently, the drug is no longer reinforcing. The same story seems to apply for amphetamine. If you destroy these dopamine-containing neurons in the nucleus accumbens, amphetamine self-administration disappears as well.
All right. So let me summarize that for
Perhaps
you.
we get pleasure
Actually, let me
from
skip
drugs
to the next
because
slide.
they stimulate the same brain areas as sex and food.
I'm having trouble. Celia, can you skip to the next slide for me?
Perhaps we
There we go. Okay. Oh, go back one. There we go. Okay. So what they're saying, this was the dopamine pleasure principle, and I'm sure most of you have heard of that before. And this is from the 50s, and it's honestly where a lot of addiction has stayed in the 50s following those experiments. Essentially, those experiments found that there was a certain center, and you saw where they had the electrode in the rat, that was the lab rat that was running around. They essentially put an electrode to the nucleus accumbens, a small area, and they found out when they tapped the bar, essentially the rat was giving itself a stimulation. It was stimulating its own brain when it tapped that bar. And it was stimulating the nucleus accumbens. And they began to behave as if, whoa, I got to go have more taps. So, and they found that they would cross over electrical currents to tap and get that brain sensation. They would risk more to get the brain sensation than they would if they put food on the other side with no brain stimulation. So they said, wow, this must be like the pleasure center. They're getting such pleasure from stimulating this that they want more. Ooh, I like that. I want to go back. I'll cross the electric grid to get there if I have to. And then the next researcher identified it was the nucleus accumbens, and they found out when they took that out of the rat, you didn't see the experiments in this, but they talked about it. When they took that out of the rat, that they quit going after drugs. They wouldn't go tap an amphetamine bar or cocaine bar or even a food bar. They're like, nah, I'm not really interested. So they presumed that the pleasure that the animal is receiving from the drugs outweighs any of the consequences. But what happened is in the 80s and 90s, and I'm gonna bring you up to date, it feels like it's up to date, but actually it's only up to the 90s because it's gotten so difficult to disseminate this information in society at large that we're kind of stuck in the 50s knowledge of the pleasure principle. No doubt that the dopamine circuit and all the research they did in the 50s was amazing research and helped us to get where we are. But other researchers worked on top of that to find something new out. And that research goes something like this. The researcher Berridge and Berridge, and I've got references in the back if you want to go read up on it. But this slide is taken from one of his papers. What they did is they said, so if the nucleus accumbens, which is dopamine, one of the nucleus in the brain that has dopamine receptors in it, if that is the pleasure, in other words, when that's stimulated, animals go, I like that. Then if we take it out, then animals shouldn't like the stimulus. And they were thinking, other than going after something, how do animals show that they like something? Other than pursuing it, like tapping a bar, how do they show that they like it? One of the ways that animals, rodents especially, do this, if they taste something that they like, they lick their lips. There's this lipping kind of repetitively, and they count how many times they lick. And the more sweet it is, the more times they lick. So there's this response of lip licking. There's other behavioral responses to indicate that an animal likes something. So they said, well, if we take this dopamine section out, like they did in the 50s, if we take it out of the brain, then they should stop showing that they like the substance. So they did that. They took the nucleus accumbens out. They gave them a substance. And what they found is the animals continue to lick their lips. And they're like, they seem to still experience pleasure, or they seem to like the stimulus. But just like the old experiments, when they took this nucleus accumbens out, even though they seemed to show they liked it, they didn't pursue it. They didn't go tap the bar. They didn't cross electrical circuits to tap the bar. They didn't show a desire. So they came up with a concept of liking and wanting as maybe being two circuits that interconnect. And so a lot of research is now being put into this thought. And when I read their research, I have to say, for the first time in my career, what patients had told me for decades finally made sense. Patients for decades had told me that were struggling with addiction to something. They would say, I don't really like it anymore. I don't want to do it anymore, but I can't seem to stop. And, they come in the hospital and they would get detox and they would go through treatment, and then they leave the hospital and they go back home. And then, at some point they'd show back up at the hospital needing detox and again. And this is when I was doing inpatient work at the time. And they would come back and they'd say, Doc, I don't know what happened. And I heard that over and over again. And I'm sure, like many of you, thought, really? I mean, obviously, if you didn't like it, you wouldn't do it. Why would you, if it didn't give you some pleasure? And then but I kept hearing that. And then I read this research and it started making sense. Things just kind of fell into place. So if there are multiple circuits, one for wanting, one for liking, and this is probably an oversimplification, it's much more complicated than this, but just to distill it down for you to make simplicity, let's say there's two circuits, a wanting circuit and a liking circuit. When you come across something for the first time and it stimulates dopamine, it gives you this, or not just dopamine, it stimulates, like, for example, marijuana doesn't stimulate dopamine, it stimulates the cannabinoid receptors. Opiates stimulate the opioid receptor. So they don't just go straight to the dopamine receptor. They stimulate various receptors in the brain, and those receptors give you a sensation of liking something the first time you're exposed to it, maybe a rush, whatever the experience was. If that neurocircuit, the liking circuit, now goes over to this dopamine circuit and says, hey, whenever you come across that again, I'm gonna hardwire in you. I'm gonna say, go for it. If you come across that sensation, go for that substance because it was good. In other words, the liking circuit talks to the wanting circuit and leaves an imprint and says, when you're exposed to the opportunity to have this, go get it. That's the difference between liking and wanting. And that's the complexity that started to make sense. Because if you contemplate it this way, if we are all, and here's the other thing, we all have these circuitries in play. We all have liking circuits and we all have wanting circuits. And now if we start to understand those circuits, they become necessary for human survival. Because if I, as an infant, like milk, it nurtures me, you know, first time you're finally fed, it stops your hunger urge. Then the next time something similar, like a nipple, comes around, whether it's a bottle or a woman, I'm going to be compelled to go back to that. It helps me to survive. And linking those two together, when a liking puts a wanting imprint, like I am going to get that if I have to have it, it makes sense when you talk about water and food. When you're really, really thirsty, I mean, have you ever just been just parched? You're like, I've got to have something right now. There is a drive like no other. You have to have it now. That is the wanting neurocircuit, not the liking. You're not thinking, oh, it tastes so good, I can't wait to have the smell of it. It doesn't have any of those features. You're just thirsty, so you want it. And that makes a lot more sense to me than it's all about whether it causes pleasure or not. Because water, honestly, I mean, yeah, it quenches your thirst, but other than that, it's not the most pleasurable thing in the world, yet we crave it like nothing else when we're dehydrated. So, new concept to this dopamine pleasure principle, it's probably the dopamine wanting principle. Pleasure is mediated by a host of different places in the brain, and that's what this picture depicts. You've got prefrontal, you got brainstem, you've got amygdala, you got a lot of places where there are hotspots of pleasure, but they all communicate to the nucleus accumbens, the dopamine area, and tell it to start wanting. All right. Very, very helpful in my treatment and with people struggling with addiction. When I came to understand that we all have these circuitries, it's just that some people's regulation of these circuitries is dysregulated. We all have these quote unquote addiction neurocircuit of wanting and liking. It's just that sometimes it gets dysregulated, and a person comes across something that stimulated pleasure so much and left such an imprint on the wanting that they have trouble controlling the wanting, even when it's not pleasurable, which made total sense when people were telling me, I just don't like it anymore, but I can't stop. When I get around it, next thing I know, I'm back in my old habits. So I find this a novel approach to substance treatment that is so empowering to the patient and to you. It gives you a model to talk about. It stops blaming the patient for it's all about the pleasure. It's more about, yeah, well, you've got this circuit that's off kilter, this wanting circuit. We got to help you figure out how to distance yourself from the triggers of that wanting circuit, because there are triggers that will trigger it and not. This circuit is triggered by the environment. If you come around something that resembles what was pleasurable, this circuit goes into action. So like if you smell, let's say you love a food, hadn't been thinking about it all day, but now you suddenly smell something you haven't had in a few months, it triggers the wanting. Wow, that would really be good right now. That smell triggered the wanting. The wanting can diminish if it's not triggered, but if it's triggered, it comes back strong. And so that's what we teach people who are struggling with an addiction to something, to anything. It's this wanting circuit. We have to figure out how to help you get cognitive control over what you're exposed to and what triggers hit this circuit. All right, I'm going to stop there for a second and ask for questions. There's one already up, because this is a really complex concept that I've distilled down to what I hope has been digestible. All right, let's see what the first question is. So this is an old question. When you imply that the substance abuses the addict, do you feel that the person is more responsible to their actions because they're basing blame more on the substance? Absolutely. Not just blame on the substance. Now that we've talked about this circuitry, we can put blame on the circuitry that they didn't create, but it may be within their brain. Let me give you an analogy. We all have a circuitry in our body of regulating blood sugar. We all have it. Complex, includes the pancreas, includes all the cells in our body with insulin receptors. It's quite a complex thing we do to regulate our sugars. We all have that circuitry. Some people have an inborn problem with regulation of that circuitry. If it's severe enough, we give it a name. It's called diabetes. Do we blame that person for having diabetes because their blood sugar circuitry is dysregulated? I hope not. So all I'm suggesting is that we do the same thing for addicts. We help them understand that, hey, you got a circuitry in here, we all have it, but yours is not as well regulated. And we need to help you understand that so you can do the best you can do to help influence that system. Just like we educate patients who have sugar regulation problems about what to avoid. They should avoid concentrated sweets. And we have to educate them about the condition which they were born into. It really gets away from blaming the patient, which pulls them on board to the treatment. They will be much more invested. It's much more uplifting. It engages them and propels them towards focusing on something that they might can exert some control over, their neurocircuitry, the substance that triggers it. So now, yes, it's more about, hey, that substance is abusing me because when I get close to it, it triggers my wanting circuit and I am just at its mercy. So I've got to distance myself from that substance. That's why abstinence works so well. Okay, we're not allowing that neurocircuitry to get triggered. Any questions on that? I'm assuming that's because you're absorbing it, and if not, please say so, because if you're not, other people may not either. And this really is, to me, one of the most important parts about today's talk is conceptualizing this circuitry. All right. Without questions, I'm going to move forward now. Polling question number 4. It's really a repeat of the previous. A person who struggles with addiction same type of person who struggles with addiction misuses substances because substances provide a feeling of pleasure. Person who struggles with addiction misuses substances because they provide a feeling of pleasure. True or false? Give you a couple more minutes, or seconds, I should say. All right, now we're 52-48. We were 60-40 before. So a few of you have been converts. The reason it's kind of a trick question. I obviously asked it on purpose. Most people would answer yes initially. So now if we think about the circuitry we just talked about, a person who struggles with addiction misuses substances because the substances provide a desire, a want. It triggers the wanting circuit. Yes, it does trigger the pleasure circuit initially. So it's not complete. It's a little bit of a tricky question, but ultimately it really triggers the want more than the pleasure, or second to the pleasure. All right, next question, number 5. All people have an addiction neurocircuitry, true or false? All right. All right. Now I converted from 40 to 72%. Very good. You're listening. All people have the neurocircuitry. In some people, it's more regulated than others. And that's ultimately what happens. All right. You were listening. That's a good sign for me. All right. So why does this matter to me? We've talked about that some already. This matters to you because you are going to come across people in your practice of whatever it is you practice. And the way in which you conceptualize this can help them combat what they're struggling with. If you can show some compassion and empathy with, wow, you've got this neurocircuitry that's a little dysregulated. Not your fault, it's just the way it is. But you have to own this. This is yours to own, just like someone with diabetes. It's your condition. You have to own it and we have to help you navigate life with it. So someone who's got struggling with dysregulation of their addiction circuitry, we've got to let them know that this is what you're born with or what you've developed. We've got to help you with it, but you have to own that, yes, there's something going on in your brain, your neurocircuitry, not you as a person. Just like it's not you as a person because you have diabetes, if your pancreas is not working like it does in most people. So same thing with this. We can help them conceptualize the neurocircuitry. It's not quite working as regulated as it could. It helps them have an explanation for what they're struggling with. Now you can help them fight off this struggle because now it's explained. The other, especially if you are writing prescriptions, here's how I conceptualize when someone gets exposed to something that triggers their pleasure center, which then imprints on the regulation, on the wanting center. It's like they have been put on a moving sidewalk and they are compelled, they are drawn in that direction towards that trigger, whatever trigger it was, substances or behaviors. They're drawn to it by that wanting circuit. And if you start someone on a medication as a prescriber, you may have just started them on this conveyor belt. They may not have ever been exposed to it. We learned about that with opiates all the time. People get exposed to it for something simple, orthopedic break, root canal, whatever. And once they're exposed to it, they have trouble not wanting it more. We have just put them on this conveyor belt. And we have a huge responsibility when we start prescribing things, because people don't walk around knowing that they're going to have a struggle with their addiction, with their neurocircuitry. They don't know that in advance unless they've already had problems with it. So that's why it's very important for all of you listening to conceptualize this differently. All right, Celia, will you please go to the next slide? It doesn't seem to work on videos for me. All right, two other circuits briefly. Mood regulation circuit. We're running out of time, but this is the main piece of the puzzle. There's other circuits. It's not just the liking and wanting. Mood regulation circuit. We have a circuit in our brain that regulates mood. Some people's circuitry is more regulated than others. People with depression, people with bipolar, their circuitry is not as well regulated. Substances affect the mood as well. And so if someone has a mood dysregulation, that may be their main reason they use, not the wanting circuit being dysregulated, but the mood circuit being dysregulated, or maybe both. So the mood regulation circuit plays another important role in whether someone develops an addiction or not for some people. All right, that's just a little visual of different moods. I'm going to move to the inhibitory control circuit. That's another circuit in our brain. All these are interacting like a amazing, much more amazing to me than any computer we could ever make. Amazing amount of interaction between all the brain. We separate these circuits out and talk about them individually. They don't exist in isolation. They're all interacting with each other all the time. But another conceptual way to think of another circuit is the inhibitory control circuit. Think about a child. They are less inhibited than an adult because their frontal lobe isn't developed till they're in their late teens, early 20s. Anyone who's raised a child can attest to that. Some people's inhibitory circuit, mostly in the frontal lobe, but it's other places in the brain too, isn't as well regulated. So they're more impulsive. And we do know there's a clear connection between impulsivity and substance use. People who are trying to fight the wanting circuit with something, if you're impulsive, you're going to have a lot more trouble fighting it because as soon as something triggers it, boom, you react. So the behavioral, the inhibitory control circuit is another circuit that can need attention in treating someone who is struggling with addiction. All right, so substance use disorder, I'm gonna skim through this. You can all read the DSM-5 criteria on this, but if you now reread them and think about these circuitries I've been talking about, I think you'll start hearing them a little differently. So if we go through the criteria, there's 3 categories. Impaired control is one category. We just talked about inhibitory control and trouble with the wanting circuit. So they take substances in larger amounts. They have a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down on usage. They spend a great deal of time in activities necessary to obtain the substance. They have a craving or strong desire to use it. That's the wanting. All these things start making sense when we think about this circuitry we've talked about. The next category, I need to go back one, there we go, is social impairment. So this wanting goes to such a degree that it begins interfering with their ability to fulfill major role obligations at work or school. Just like the rat that crosses the electrical grid to get to that experience, humans are the same way. They will suffer a lot of pain because the wanting is so strong, and they'll lose family members. They'll lose jobs. They will endure a lot of difficulties, but it's not because they're just looking for the pleasure. It's because the initial pleasure stimulated a wanting that they're having trouble combating. And we got to help them combating the want. All right, so next category, risky use. So they continue use in risky situations. Again, understand the wanting, the drive, it all starts making sense. There's this neurological circuit that we're driven towards this thing, regardless of what's going on, just like water. You would cross a dangerous path to get to water if you were in a desert and needed water. You would start doing all the same behaviors an addict would do. And so when you think of it that way, you recognize that we all have this circuitry. It's just dysregulated. They get there much quicker than we do, and they're struggling with fighting this neurocircuitry. All right. And then there are pharmacological indicators. We talked about tolerance and withdrawal. Tolerance is that habituation I talked about in the beginning. Withdrawal is typically people talk about physical withdrawal, and that's what this is talking about in the DSM-5. I like to expand that to other physical aspects like mood, because now you can begin to see that it's all physiological. It's not someone's defective psychologically. It is they have an issue with the neurochemistry and the neurobiology and the circuitry within their brain. All right. They go through different substance categories that people struggle with. I think you're all familiar with these if you've been in the treatment world or even in life for any length of time at all. Now, what influences developing, I'm going to probably wrap up with this because we're running short on time, but let me see. What influences developing a substance use disorder? Are you just born with it? Is it purely genetic? Well, it's not purely genetic, but genetics does play a significant role. If you have a second or third degree relative, your chances are multiplied by 1.5. If you have a first degree relative, your chances are multiplied by 1.9. And if you have first and second or third degree, your chances are multiplied by almost 3. So clearly genetics play a role, but it's not the only thing. There's a lot of things that influence genetics. We're born with a genetic profile, but the expression of those genes, and this is another complex concept, the expression of those genes are affected by the environment. Not all genes are turned on that we have. Sometimes it's an environmental thing, whether it's like the living environment or even the environment within the brain. What chemicals are floating around in the brain can determine whether a gene is turned on or not. So genes play a role, but it's not the only role. We are born with somewhat of a blueprint, but that blueprint, that genetic blueprint, becomes altered by our environment, mostly during our development, which for the brain occurs from day one of conception until you're in your 20s, is when most of it has developed. It can still develop after that, but our brain is not finalized, even remotely so, until we're in our early 20s. So developmental stages are important, which is why we know that if someone is exposed to a substance in their teens, much higher chance of having an addiction problem than if they're exposed to that substance for the first time after the brain's finished developing. So a lot of influences go into developing a substance use disorder. We are down to 5 or 6 minutes. I'm going to stop and ask for any last questions before we wrap things up. Any clinical questions you have, any how to interact with patients, or even just comments to say, yeah, I'm having trouble with this section of, I'm having trouble identifying with what you're saying. Not that you don't understand it, just that you're not sure you agree with it. So, all right, oh, there's one. Let's see what they say. Seems that if a lot of all have heightened interest in your explanation of motivation reward circuitry, we spent a bit of time there. We needed more time. That was great. Thank you very much for that comment. Yes, I did spend a lot of time there. It is a very, I think, pivotal concept for you to take away from today's. That was really the crux of the talk, was helping you understand this neurocircuitry. It will change what you do in treating people with substances. Now, just a little segue, on August 20th, I'm going to go to the next step of this talk, and I'm going to talk about treating people with addiction. We're going to talk about boundaries and motivational interviewing. So I purposely didn't get into the treatment aspect. I'm wanting you to get this concept that I discussed about the neurocircuitry. We will come back August the 20th, and we're going to talk about treating and how to interact with patients with this new concept I just gave you. So if you followed this one, you come back August 20th, those 2 hours together will put it together for you. So thanks for listening.
Yes, and Dr. Westfall, we want to just thank you. I have learned a lot personally myself, so I'm glad that I was able to participate in this webinar. I want to just say to everyone, a link to the webinar, webinar evaluation will be sent to you to your email on Monday. Once you complete the evaluation, your attendance will be reported to the appropriate association for CME/CE purposes. And thank you all for participating, and we're looking forward to you registering for future webinars.